It's February 2026, Russia's war against Ukraine is in its fourth year, and today we're taking another look at the military situation. I'm Julian Repke, and this is Build Situation Room. We're starting once again in the northeastern Ukrainian region of Kharkiv. The battle for Kupiansk is still raging there, but it's a battle that is actually over 90% decided and in favor of Ukraine. If we look at the latest map from the Russian Ministry of Defense, or rather a map from pro-Russian activists that is based directly on information from the Ministry of Defense, then we see Moscow's wishful thinking right here, because here we see the city of Kupiansk. I think you can just draw it in for a second. So here is the city, and we see it is roughly 90 to 95% under Russian control and marked in dark red. This right here is the color for solid Russian control. And then we have the offensive movement basically into this yellow zone. Further on towards the west, so that is the Russian view, the official Russian version of the situation there in Kupiansk. However, let's let this play out and see what the situation is really like, because there are many current videos from both sides, here from the Ukrainian side, showing us that the last remnants of the Russian army in Kupiansk are currently being killed there, or driven out, or taken prisoner. And right here we see a house, which is probably a former school building, if we look at it, where Russian soldiers are still inside, but they're no longer in defensive positions, no longer on the upper floors to fight back. Instead, they're just huddling together somewhere in the basement and refusing to defend themselves. So what are we seeing? Accordingly, the Ukrainians are entering through the various entrances and are likely using TM62 mines or other explosives with a time fuse, now being placed here into the cellars, so to speak, placed very deep down. And now we're about to see the situation where these mines are detonated one after another, presumably leading to the deaths of the last Russians in this building. This all shows us quite clearly that it is the Ukrainians who are able to move around freely in Kupiansk, who are in charge and basically control the ground, while the Russians are merely hiding out within a few bunkers here underground, just to avoid being killed there. And we have another recording, in this case from the Russian army, and this footage also shows quite clearly that ground control, meaning the large residential areas here, is under Ukrainian control, while the Russians are only attacking from the air, meaning from maybe 5 or 10 or 15 kilometers away with their drones, trying to salvage whatever they can, what can be saved. However, as it stands right now, and we'll see this on the map in a moment, probably about 90 to 95% of the city is under Ukrainian control. And we just saw it too, the whole East Bank, which is supposedly under Russian control, according to our information. Not a single Russian soldier is there right now. So here's the footage showing us how the Russians are attacking Kupiansk from the air. And this is in stark contradiction to their own map, which showed that the whole area is dark red. The whole thing is clearly under Russian control. The reality, and all these videos from both sides keep showing this, is just completely different. The reality is exactly what we are seeing right here on the map from our provider Deep State Map. We have just seen it, something along those lines, meaning the eastern part of Kupiansk, located over on that eastern riverbank of the Oskil River. And this here is the western part of Kupiansk. Like I said, the river, you see it here, runs right through the middle. We can see it. There is still a small area where Russian soldiers are holding out, but they are no longer in any position to advance from there. Also, those arrows we just saw are complete nonsense. Instead, we see they're just stuck there trying to survive and just hoping that they will eventually be rescued. We also see there's still a very thin connecting line, which is, however, being attacked from both sides by Ukraine. And that is precisely why the Russians currently cannot advance in Kupiansk, nor manage to pull back their remaining units to retreat into the red areas here in the north. So the situation in Kupiansk is completely different from what Russian propaganda officially claims. And right now, it simply doesn't look like the Russians are going to be taking the city. Elsewhere in Ukraine, however, the Russian army is still pushing further ahead. However, these are mostly symbolic successes. Currently, the offensive in southern Ukraine in Zaporizhia has been halted by Ukraine over the past days and weeks. There is fighting in the gray zone, where both sides keep moving back and forth there. Accordingly, the Russians are trying to achieve symbolic successes. Once again, in the Sumy region in the north of the country, they've captured another village right there on the border. First, we're seeing Russian footage here of the attack on the defending soldiers. Here we see more Ukrainian soldiers moving to safety, being attacked by the Russians right nearby. And right now, a kamikaze drone as well, being steered toward one of these soldiers who is trying to find cover right here from the Russians who are shooting at them, presumably shooting at them with other ammo as well. And right now we're about to see, after this mortar here is attacked, the Russian flag in the small village of Pokrovka. Here we see the flag being raised, and this is a village right on the border in Sumy, which belongs to this so-called buffer zone territory. So that's where the Russians say we'll just go into Ukraine in any region, regardless of whether it's Donbass or not, and try to establish control there within Ukraine so that the 2024 Kursk fiasco doesn't happen again and the Ukrainian army doesn't, what was that, over 1,000 square kilometers occupied inside Russia. So the Russians are trying for these small symbolic victories here. They just go a few hundred meters across the border and attack the Ukrainian soldiers who are there. It's extremely hard for the Ukrainians to defend because the Russians have so many drone teams on their side of the border, and then tries to briefly raise the flag there accordingly, at least to show that, yeah, we're moving forward and we're carrying out these orders from Vladimir Putin. We can first take a look at the whole thing from a distance before we zoom in further. This buffer zone the Russians are talking about is basically a zone several kilometers wide along the entire border they're trying to establish. We see individual successes of theirs here in the north, near Sumy, for example. At Lipsy, success has been seen at Vovchansk, and also, it must be said, north of Kupiansk, not right at the city, but they're there managing to keep pushing this zone further and further. But if we look at this whole buffer zone they wanted to set up here, which also extends further up towards Chernihiv, they've maybe got about 10% of it so far, and 90%, namely all of these areas, they are all still under Ukrainian control directly along the border. We're zooming in further now and see how the Russians are advancing right here in Pokrovka, which we just saw, and we also see here quite realistically that was indeed a Russian flag, what we saw, but we just don't know if that flag was only there briefly, if the Ukrainians have come back. Also from our map provider, Deep State Map, here Pokrovka and the surroundings marked in orange. There's still fighting going on there, and we see just how easy the Russians have it. Basically, they went in here, 2-3 kilometers into the other country, presumably defeated the Ukrainians there, at least for the time being, in this small village, and then raised the flag there. All of this over and over again to show we're there, we're moving forward. However, I don't want to downplay this at all. We see here a little bit further south around Hrabovsk. We also had the situation about 2 months ago where the first Russians were there and a flag was raised. The Ukrainians said, yeah, it was very brief, we pushed them back. However, we see it here, a pro-Ukrainian map provider, Deep State Map, which nonetheless tells us that Hrabovsky and also 2 neighboring villages are now firmly under Russian control. This means that here as well the Russians are succeeding, at least in very slow steps, in slowly capturing parts within Ukraine, village by village. We want to look at the latest techniques and innovations from both sides to make progress in this war. First, we have a video showing us how coordination takes place, namely by a so-called UGV. That is an unmanned ground vehicle or robotic complex, which is what the Ukrainians call it. And we can see quite clearly here that this ground complex is now armed, meaning it has a machine gun mounted on it and is now attacking a Russian position. The whole thing. It's quite interesting now, as we're seeing for the first time, or not the first time, but once again, coordination. Specifically an FPV drone here, so a small drone, probably a Mavic or something similar, which has spotted the Russian infantrymen here. We see it on the thermal camera quite clearly between these houses. And on the right side, we'll see it in a moment, this robotic complex is driving in. Now he's taken up his position, doesn't see the soldier himself, but we see from above, now we see it that it is monitoring the whole thing, then fires exactly where the drone basically tells him to. So we can see quite clearly here, I don't need to mark the left side, that's the Russian soldier standing right here. On the right side, here's the UGV, and we also see the muzzle flash. This means they're firing directly in this direction, and of course we have to pixelate the whole thing. We also see how the Russian soldier gets hit by the machine gun now and collapses right here accordingly. This all shows us that the Ukrainians are trying more and more to even replace their assault units, or at least supplement them currently with robotic systems. And that is just further evidence that they are succeeding, at least in part, by not only using drones in the air, but also deploying drones on the ground and then attacking together right here to spare the lives of their own people and accordingly to attack the Russian soldiers where they've taken up positions in the occupied villages in the east and south of Ukraine. All this shows us that innovation continues. Ukraine is trying to gain ground in this area. At the same time, we see that Ukraine is also copying a lot from the Russians. That means fiber optic technology, one that was introduced last year or at the end of the year before, introduced in late 2024, which the Russians brought into this whole war. And they have managed to overcome many of the previous limits regarding drone capabilities, such as operating inside buildings, flying very close to the ground, or even operating in bunkers. That these capabilities were gained by the Russians. The Ukrainians have since copied this, and we can see that in the following video, which shows us quite well that once again absolutely everything has been totally destroyed here. The Russians have taken up their positions in a cellar, effectively acting like a kind of bunker in a house located on the surface. We'll see it in a moment from further away, where everything's ruined, where due to the shelling you couldn't tell from which side. Here we see it already, the roof was destroyed, the house back there was destroyed, and the other houses too would obviously be extremely hard to stay in because they're so vulnerable to artillery and things like that. Unlike the bunker we just saw, here's the entrance where the Russian soldier just looked out. Down there you are underground and feel safe because you are relatively safe from artillery and things like that. However, we now see the Ukrainian drone approaching from below. I hope now. Right now it's zooming in. We see it all quite well now, and we see it better and better. It is a fiber optic guided drone. We can see that. We can take another look at it once more. Exactly, we can see that quite well here because, for one, we see the drone with its quadcopter in front, but then, crucially, this large fiber optic spool unwinding there, and the fiber optic cable, which comes straight out the back and reaches the operator 10 to 15 kilometers away. This drone can now operate very close to the ground. A radio drone couldn't do any of that and can fly very precisely into this bunker and then completely destroy it. This means the Russians, who thought they were safe there, who were relatively secure against radio drones and artillery and so on, were now buried right here and presumably also killed in their position under this farm they had destroyed, or whatever that place might have actually been. So small houses in this little village, that means we see innovation is moving forward. The Russians brought it in and they still use it thousands of times every day, but Ukraine's successfully copying it here. And yeah, what can you do against drones like these that just chase you, can target you so precisely, and even follow you inside buildings? There are two options. One is to run away, and the other is to actively defend yourself. Hardly anyone dares to do that, though, because it's a very, very dangerous undertaking and simply a game of life and death. We now have footage of a unit of the Ukrainian army, namely the Azov unit from the city of Kostiantynivka, of so-called drone hunters, meaning Ukrainian soldiers, who do not simply run away, but rather actively go out and attack these fiber optic or radio-controlled drones in the sky and shoot them down by themselves. So we can see it right here, where they are attacking with an assault rifle and are actually shooting at these drones. And now we'll see it again, first just the smoke. So there's the drone that just hit, that was moving, not even necessarily towards those soldiers, but rather at targets like vehicles or similar that the Russians had spotted beforehand. This unit right here is in an extremely tough, extremely dangerous situation. They are basically positioned between the Russian drone operators and the main Ukrainian units, trying to destroy the drones on their way to their targets. Now we're seeing a compilation of several of these attacks here, as I said, all in Kostiantynivka. And now we see it here. The next drone is approaching right now. It's not even flying directly at the unit, or rather it would have flown over it probably. And now we see it here. Shots are fired, and at that moment, I hope you can see it here, fire is coming out the back of the drone, meaning this one too is now damaged and will therefore, yeah, exactly, here it is once more in the summary. It will likely crash within just a few seconds, and it just keeps going on and on like that. That means we really have Ukrainians here going on drone hunts and, of course, filming the whole thing accordingly just so they can show it off. Here we see an attack on drones on standby. That means the Ukrainians discovered that drones were basically stationed on the ground by the Russians. Likely looking in the other direction, though, otherwise there'd be a bigger problem here. Otherwise it would be rising. Now the Ukrainian is shooting at the drones, and we can see the explosions right here on the ground. Yeah, and it just keeps going like that. We can let it run a bit longer to the end just to see. Ukraine has decided, at least to some extent, that they want to fight back, not just be victims of these drones, but use the only means, which is actually shooting them down. In fact, to take action against them in the skies. It used to be, of course, that electronic warfare, like jammers and other things, helped against these drones. So you could quite often rely on the fact that, at least in the vicinity of the vehicles or units, the drones then crashed. With fiber optic drones, that's simply no longer the case. That's why we also attended a so-called dronicide last year, basically a training of the 413th Regiment of the Unmanned Systems Forces, who demonstrated how to hunt fiber optic drones using shotguns. Here we see it also works with electronic rifles if you're an extremely good shot. For other Russian drones like Shaheds, assault rifles offer little help. These are 4.7 meter long drones moving at altitudes of up to 4 kilometers over Ukraine. Last night there were several hundred of them again. What helps against them, however, are Sidewinder missiles from F-16 fighter aircraft. And here we have a new video from an eyewitness who filmed this right from the ground as an F-16 basically goes on a Shahed hunt. Now we see the F-16 here as it carries out its flight, and we'll see in a moment how a missile is being fired. Now we see it. I'll try to mark it real quick where you can see it. So here's the Sidewinder missile, the F-16 up front, and this missile is now moving towards the Shahed drone. Let's keep it running. Towards the drone, several hundred meters away. And now we see the primary explosion here. That means the drone was hit and is burning. And now here's the secondary explosion. That means that's the drone's warhead going off, which was actually meant to hit critical infrastructure or a residential building or whatever in Ukraine. That means we're seeing Ukraine remain extremely active and extremely successful when it comes to using F-16 aircraft against Russian drones. Interesting, F-16 are actually offensive weapons being used as defensive weapons in Ukraine. And we've seen and heard that over the last few days, at least in media reports, that veterans, meaning former F-16 pilots from the Netherlands and the US, are supposedly partly involved in the controls here, so the pilots flying those planes. And that would at least be one explanation why the Ukrainian Air Force built up this capability in such a short time to use F-16 so successfully against these hundreds of terror drones that are being launched against Ukraine every single night. Ukraine also continues to use drones to attack high-value targets of the Russian army. These are different drones from the Shahed, but nonetheless with similar capabilities. We are seeing several attacks right here, for one on an S-300 VM system of the Russian army. Here we see how a Ukrainian Special Forces unit attacks this very system. Yeah, worth many millions, of course, and yet we see it. I think the video cuts off at the end. We see it in this instance that this S-300 system simply cannot defend itself, so it doesn't see the drone and can't engage it either as it flies towards it and is then destroyed right here. We've got more current videos coming up of attacks on armored systems. Here too we see the drones, which likely aren't using AI but are steered by a pilot right until the very last moment directly into the systems. We see all these control mechanisms, which of course also help the pilots tell, based on the degrees, based on the artificial horizon where I'm flying right now, where I'm currently at, how I'm moving the drone right now. There too we see various parameters. And at the end, we see a Panzer S-1 system of the Russian army with ZOV right there on the front. So this propaganda isn't really helping much either. And what's getting hit directly? And we see that in a number of cases. This means we can recognize that Ukrainian drones are superior in this system clearly. Once they actually manage to find them, you can see that in the following clip. Because here, at least, in the next shot, the drone was at least detected by the system. It's firing one of its missiles now, but the missile misses. The drone keeps flying and flies right in. And the second drone, which is also used for the attack, here we see it, has the same angle of attack and now sees right here how the tank system is already burning and then still flies right in anyway, just to ensure that the destruction is indeed fully complete. Yes, and this keeps happening not just in Crimea, but also in occupied Ukraine, in the occupied mainland, and in Russia, that Ukraine manages to destroy many of the Russian systems. It also shows, and this is truly impressive, how many hundreds, I'd almost say how many thousands of advanced Russian air defense systems currently exist, because we've seen so many videos already of these destructions, of the explosions, whether it's Panzer, Tor, Buk, S-300 or even S-400, that you might actually start to get the idea that Russia would slowly be running out of them. I think the numbers are dropping. Of course, Russia can't restock that fast, but we're seeing just how massively the Russian war economy is currently working to keep producing and accordingly be able to ensure further air defense. And this Russian war economy obviously needs oil and gas in order to operate. Accordingly, Ukraine continues to try and strike here inside Russia with many pinprick attacks. And we have a new video here from the night before last. There, the unmanned system forces, meaning Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, once again managed to attack the refinery in Ilsky in the Krasnodar region. We first saw footage from the night before last, right with the attack where we saw the fire. These are billed from yesterday during the day, where the fire is still blazing. And there are also images from this morning showing that even on the second day after the attack, the refinery in Ilsky is still burning. This means the Russians seem to be having trouble putting the whole thing out, and you can't forget that Ukraine keeps launching new attacks every single night. Not necessarily the same facility, but repeatedly attacking different parts of Russia and accordingly putting the Russian security forces and of course the firefighting crews under pressure. Let's take a quick look at the map to see where exactly Ukraine has struck here. As I said, we are in the Krasnodar region, also very close to the city of Krasnodar, situated right near Novorossiysk. As we are all certainly very well aware, from Novorossiysk, a truly very large part of the Caspian oil and also oil from the Caucasus is indeed being exported to the whole world, or at least towards the countries that continue to buy Russian gas and buy oil. And so it's basically a strategically important place, Ilsky. We can see down here the Caspian Sea is roughly in that direction. The Caucasus is in this direction here. and we see the whole thing basically right on the way. Ildsky, of course, then accordingly at the actual refinery itself, which is trying to turn the oil into fuel. Doesn't necessarily have to be for export, could also be for the Russian economy. Nevertheless, we see Ukraine has struck successfully here, even though we see here in the corner that's about 100 kilometers. This means that the Ukrainian drone most likely flew approximately 1,000 kilometers once again, going all the way around Crimea and the occupied territory to get there. Otherwise, it's just relatively dangerous to fly over the occupied territories in Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and the Crimea. Insofar as many of these attacks actually occur via the Black Sea, we see that Russia is still making extremely slow progress in southern Ukraine. As I mentioned earlier, there are even minor Ukrainian counterattacks, at least within the gray zone, and Ukraine continues to try to weaken the Russian economy, to effectively disrupt the Russian attack on the country, this illegal attack under international law.